Welcome to BYJU'S IAS and welcome to this very special series of lectures which allows you to appreciate better what is happening in the world around us. This weekly review of international events gets us into an insight into India's foreign policy, India's national interest, and how the power equations of big powers are affected in the past week by events. This time what we want to do with you is a very interesting topic. The 42nd summit meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC for short, has attracted the world's attention. This organization was formed 4 decades ago. It has had a very checkered history. At times it seems to play an important role, potentially promising. At times it seems to be divided, a house divided within itself. But in the present context, this meeting becomes very important because in the past year there has been a major realignment of forces within the Middle Eastern West Asian region. Israel has tried to normalize its relationship with Saudi Arabia and UAE. Turkey has been active on the fringes. Iran has been seen as a threatening posture, both because of its nuclear program and its support to Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in southern Yemen. So there has been a situation which is in a bit of a turmoil, and especially after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the whole area, adjacent area, seems to be very volatile. And also some countries in this region, this GCC members, touch the borders of Iraq and proximate to Iran, and they have differences amongst themselves. We will discuss all this and a lot more from the Indian point of view, how important is this region, and this is what we shall be focusing on. Let us begin at the beginning. The Gulf Cooperation Council was established in 1981, and this was the time when the world was very optimistic about regional integration. The European Union was doing very well, ASEAN was doing very well, and it was sort of thought that if the countries in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, some call it just the Gulf because they don't think very easily the Persian hegemony should be conceded, should also unite. And these countries were small in size, except they had large geographical expanse like Saudi Arabia or even Oman, but the other countries had very small populations. But what was most important about these countries was that all of them were oil producing countries, oil exporting countries, and they controlled a very large chunk of the proven global oil resources, Saudi Arabia being the most prominent example, but Bahrain and Kuwait were not unimportant. And this was the time when the world had recovered from the 1970s oil energy crisis which the OPEC countries had administered, and it was coping for a variety of strategies so that the Western world would not be starving for energy when it needed. Now, Saudi Arabia is a very important member of the GCC. It is the largest country geographically, it is the richest reserves of oil, and it has a high per capita income. The other countries are Kuwait, Bahrain, comparatively much smaller, Oman, Qatar, and the UAE. Now, let's have a look at them, not one by one, but what are the different kinds of natures of polities there. All of them are Muslim countries with varying degrees of Muslim population in their total population. They are monarchies, but interestingly, Saudi Arab would be a kind of a monarchy, or Oman would be a kind of a monarchy, or Kuwait could be a kind of a monarchy, which would not be constitutional monarchies. And there would be something like Qatar, which would be a constitutional monarchy. Now, this is one difference, but we'll see the differences, ironical differences even more. When we come to UAE, is a very interesting federation. It is a federation of monarchies. And the disparity between the economic and social development and the outlook towards the world varies very greatly. The world thinks that Dubai and Abu Dhabi are as good as an extension of the Western world. They are far more tolerant. They have prohibitions. They are prescribed by the Shariat law, but they are more comfortable places to do business with. They treat foreigners differently. They don't have interference with personal freedoms of the expats and so on. And the general climate is supposed to be more tolerant. But there are other members. Sharjah is well known in India, with whom we play cricket matches are organized there also. But if you keep out Abu Dhabi, Dubai and Sharjah, then the other countries like Fujairah, Ras Al Khaimah, Ul Aqwam, Ajman, these are countries we know Emirates, we know little about. They are different countries and members of UN in their own right, but UAE works as a bloc. So you have UAE, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Kuwait, you have Bahrain, you have Qatar, you have Oman. These are the countries which are here. So first differences between monarchies which are absolute monarchies and monarchies which are constitutional monarchies, countries which are federations of monarchies with disagreement of their own, disparities of their own, and also not all of them may be Muslim, all of them are oil producing, but there is no general agreement because there are clashes of interest. And during the Cold War, what had happened is that Saudi Arabia was allied very obviously with the Americans, but the other countries also had allowed US bases to operate from. So there is, one might argue that all of them were generally inclined towards West and towards the United States of America. And the United States of America was very comfortable with the arrangement because the American oil major companies controlled the extraction and refining of the oil, and the Saudis and the UAE were very happy receiving the royalties, having a very high standard of life, as long as the Americans did not hurt their egos. But the problem is that we said something about very small populations in these countries. Small population is an advantage because the monarchies could keep their people happy, the subjects happy, there was no income tax, the level of income was very high, social services were provided by the monarch, and monarch was seen as a benevolent father figure. In case of Saudi Arabia, there was another additional factor which added to its power and prestige and lent weight and gravitas to the Gulf Cooperation Council was that Saudis were the custodians of the holiest shrines of the Muslim world, Makkah and the Medina. But the problem is, if you have a very small population and you are getting a large income through your royalty of oil exports, the problem is that everybody gets used to A, not working for economic development. You think that you don't need to have economic development. You can buy all the luxuries, all the weapons and live happily ever after. But then the problem is to work out services, work out infrastructure, to have your oil flowing in the pipeline. You need expatriates. And soon comes a stage when the number of expatriates in technically high-tech jobs as well as low-tech menial jobs and services is so great that there is a threat perception among the large Muslim population that the outsiders might sort of overtake them and take over. So you have this cycle of fears and promise. You can't do without expats. You can't tolerate them as equals. The money which you earn is so huge that you think that even the American masters don't have any potential to put any pressure on you. They need you more than you need them. And this leads to a situation of an anxiety complex as well as an arrogance as well as reluctance to change. Now, Saudi Arabia is an excellent example of this. The case of Saudi Arabia throwing its weight around has been a cause of concern. When journalist Khashoggi, who was an Arab journalist but now settled in America, was murdered in Turkey within the diplomatic territory of Saudi Arabia's embassy, it created a big sensation, and the conspiracy led straight to the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's supposed to be very ambitious, supposed to be very autocratic, supposed to be, unpredictable, but also at the same time a man having great plans for Saudi Arabia and its modernization. So there is this tension, this dialectical tension in Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is not the only country which is looked upon with such apprehension, because take the other extreme, take Qatar. Qatar is one of the richest countries in the world, enjoys a very high level, and we said it's an elective constitutional monarchy. But the trouble is that the elective constitutional monarchy is not like the constitutional monarchy in United Kingdom and Britain. And it has been accused of helping the more extreme factions of the dogmatic Islamic factions, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, even Taliban in Afghanistan. It also has been trying to keep its bridges open for dialogue and negotiations with Iran. So Qatar has been suspected by the other countries and also the West. But we shall right now focus on the divergences of these countries. Especially countries like Kuwait and Bahrain and Qatar are dependent on expatriates to such a large extent that their own population in, let's say, 1.5 million, 2.45 million, they are just 3,500,000 to 5 and 600,000. The rest are expatriates. And this is a balance where these might be people from India, Pakistan, Philippines, Nepal, and this seems to threaten the demographic profile there also. Qatar also alienated Saudi Arabia by projecting a profile which was more global, more cosmopolitan. The Doha round of World Economic Forum took place there. They had a media which was freer than any other media in this whole area, in the Gulf area, is the Al Jazeera network, which was patterned on BBC. It was supposed to be independent. Of course, there is a very subtle tilt towards the interests of the Islamic nations, but it is much more open than any other media. So this was an issue of friction between Qatar, Saudi Arabia and other countries. There also is a little conflict of interest and rivalry between UAE and Saudi Arabia, especially since Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman took over, because he wanted to slowly open up his country so it could compete with UAE, because everybody wanted to work in either Abu Dhabi or Dubai. They had the Formula One races, they had the football FIFA World Cup things, they wanted to have open duty-free shopping for everybody. So Saudi Arabs in recent past made a very interesting declaration that if the countries wanted to benefit of trade with Saudi Arabia, they would have to locate their factories and industrial units and locate their headquarters there in Saudi Arabia. So obviously all the big companies which is so far located for convenience reasons, their headquarters in UAE, were upset because they now would have to relocate if they wanted a slice of the pie of the Saudi Arab market in Saudi Arabia. And there was no guarantee that the Saudi Arabs' promise would be kept, like people have got built some trust about Abu Dhabi or Dubai, but it would take a long time before Saudi Arabia could do that. So three things, please remember: different kinds of polities, different kinds of economic promise between, large countries, fine. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait have no problems about the oil. But all these countries are also worried about what happens when fossil fuels are discarded and rejected, what would happen to their future. So they have tried to go develop tourism, they have tried to go into areas of high tech which are, shall we say, post-fossil fuel future. It may seem to be a long time now, but well, the signs are there, the writing on the wall is clear, so they have been trying to do that. Oman is a good example of that Oman has already started promoting its tourism, its environmental conservation, its prehistoric, pre-Islamic past, all these things are there. So you have a community of interest among 6 countries of Gulf Cooperation Council, but at the same time, there are conflicts within, there are different historical experiences, different kind of self-images about their role to play. Like Saudi Arabia would think itself to be the natural leader of all the Islamic world, but the point is that UAE would say that, look, we are far more modern in our outlook, the world accepts us more readily, so we might not be leading the whole of Islamic world, but practically we would be the cutting edge, we will be the door and windows for the West to the Islamic world. And it also would be a very cosmopolitan place where the Chinese would be there, where the Indians would be there, where Pakistanis would be there, and so on. At the same time, there would be always lurking behind the large shadow of Iran. What do you do with Iran? If these countries unite and there is a block here, will Iran sit quiet? And would it not perceive this as a threat? Now, before we come to that, we have to say that the GCC was founded in 1981. 4 decades have passed. Not all the potential and promise has been realized. Why has been this? How the world events have influenced it is interesting for us to see and important to realize. The first thing which we should focus on is, why is it that the Gulf Cooperation Council did not make the expected progress, gather the momentum which it was expected to? I think it is pointless to blame the member states for that. They were rich countries, they were earning a lot of money from their oil exports, and they thought that this golden age of black gold would never end. They had very small populations, there was a lot of money being earned, so the local population, the subjects, could be freed of the burden of income tax. They could be provided services, health and housing, and employment was not in short supply, although most of the local people were not particularly inclined to do the dirty work or work. As long as they were given everything free, they were very happy if the democratic rights were denied, because they thought that the Sultan or the Amir was like the elder in the tribal family who would look after all their interests, although he might be strict to enforce discipline. This mindset led to a situation where a large influx of expatriates to work as domestics, as servants, as menials, as engineers, technicians, drivers, guards, lawyers, journalists was imported. Except Saudi Arabia, no other member state of GCC has a large population. Most of them have populations which are between 150,000 to 250,000 people, while the expatriates number in millions. The situation is not very different in Saudi Arabia, although the balance is in favor of the local population. The second is that although all these countries were rich, they were dependent on others to maintain their economy going. In the world, since 1980s till the turn of the 21st century, there were so many developments, so many crises elsewhere, that the people thought that these countries were low priority countries for them. They were more worried about what was happening in China, what was going to happen in Russia. So the Russian withdrawal from Afghanistan after occupation for a long time, disintegration of the Soviet Empire, Soviet Union, the relationship between the new regime, which took the Russians to almost tottering to the verge of bankruptcy and anarchy. Those were the issues which were concerning the world elsewhere. But the point is that the stability of the Gulf Cooperation Council area was always very fragile. As we discussed earlier, they are all monarchies, they are all Islamic nations, but there is a great difference between them. There are some constitutional monarchies, some absolute monarchies, some federating monarchies, and all of them have ambitions of their own and historical memories of their own. So I think the thing which made it possible to think in terms of the Gulf Cooperation Council in a manner, in a renewed vigor, was only when European Union started expanding and the experiment seemed to be succeeding. European Union did it very slowly. First there was a coal and steel union, then there was a customs union, then there was a common market, and then came to a European Union idea. So it was a slow progress towards regional integration. People thought that this is what was happening in ASEAN and this is what would happen in the Middle East in the Gulf Cooperation Council. But it did not happen that way, because these rich, arrogant Emirates, don't misunderstand the word arrogant. There is an arrogance of power, there is an arrogance of riches, and there is an arrogance in an absolute monarchy of the feeling that entitlement, there is a divine right to rule. Our subjects are happy with us, so who are you to tell us what we should do, how we should live? Don't tell us that we are living in Middle Ages, don't tell us, this is the Arab way of life. Now, you see, therein lies a catch. When we talk in terms of Arab way of life, we forget that there is an Arab civilization which is as old as any in the world. These are the Arab countries like Iraq and Syria which are inheritors to this civilization. But the marsh Arabs, the Bedouin Arabs, the desert Arabs are not all inheritors to the same heritage. So these were people who had been given a glorified idea of their own historical past and their future role by the British, like Glab Pasha and the person who's known as Lawrence of Arabia during the First and the Second World War. The two shield states were given an exaggerated notion of what they could do. Americans, of course, played it along because they wanted to control the Saudi oil. They wanted, of course, to control the Iranian oil. They wanted to control all other oil. But primary partner was Saudi Arab. And Saudi Arab, once it joined the American military alliance system, others also made their bases available to the USA. The USA thought that these countries could be taken for granted as long as they were dependent on US for their defense support. Trump infamously said recently, just before he demitted office, was defeated, that if he withdrew protection from Saudi Arabia, the Hashemite regime would not really, the Saudi regime would not stay in place for more than 2 weeks. Now, the same applies to other monarchies in Jordan and Morocco, etc. But the American arrogance also of power that only they are protecting these countries was resented. So that's one part. Also the very strange kind of succession which takes place in these absolute monarchies. Is the crown might pass from elder brother to younger brother, from son to nephew, and so on. So Saudi Arabia came to a stage where Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is effectively wielding all the power, political power in that country, and he's a very kind of complex personality. At one level he's autocratic, at one level he's cruel, alleged to be cruel, at one level he's supposed to be intolerant of opposition, at the same time he's a modernist outlook. He's slowly, gradually opening up his country, giving more rights to women, allowing them to drive, to vote, to take up some jobs with some restrictions in public areas. He is trying to open up the country and make it as comfortable for expatriates as Abu Dhabi, Dubai, etc. are. But what created problems in progress was that people were very, very apprehensive about what Qatar was doing. And now Qatar was a very small country compared to Saudi Arabia, but very, very rich. And Qatar was following a course which was very different. While Saudi Arabs could claim that they were the custodians of the holy places, they were the natural leaders of the Islamic world. But the Qatar thought that it should at least be given credence as a regionally important actor within the GCC members family. And the allegation of Saudi Arabia against Qatar was that it was encouraging, supporting, financing the hardcore dogmatic ISIL, the Al-Qaeda, the Islamic Brotherhood in this area, in the extended area of West Asia. And these were natural challengers to Saudi Arabia's monopolistic leadership claims in this area. So that was one. The other thing which was contrasting and ironically very different was that Qatar had a very, very independent media, which was Al Jazeera, modeled on BBC, which was exhibiting to the world that it had freedom of expression. And it was objective. It was focusing on the plights of the Muslims all over the world. It was subtly tilted in its coverage about the interests of the Islamic world, but it was also considered to be a challenge by the other monarchies, absolute monarchies, who thought that Qatar was trying to subvert their absolutist claims for divine right to rule and entitlement. So the crisis came to a head. The crisis came to a head because there were three reasons. A, all countries which were depending on oil exports for their income were made to realize, due to the continued challenge of climate change and the international public opinion turning against fossil fuels, that they have to be cut down. And if you go from fossil fuels, petrol, gas, coal, to other renewable energy resources, nuclear energy resources, these countries would suddenly, if not be impoverished overnight, their economy would be very, very risk-prone in the coming years to come. So they did not know what to do. They had to divert their economic development from fossil fuels to other, maybe tourism, maybe high-tech areas, maybe services, maybe tourism, maybe duty-free export-import, whatever it was. Abu Dhabi and Dubai had already started this 10 years back. Saudi Arabia is trying to do it now. So the question is, can they catch up with the neighbors next door? And will their promises be having credibility for the West, keeping in mind their fickleness in some other matters? That's one. So what had happened was the matters came to a crisis in 2017 when Saudi Arabia decided to issue an ultimatum to Qatar and said that close down your Al Jazeera network, it is subversive, it is subverting our authority. B, stop aiding Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Islamic Brotherhood, because they are illegitimate challengers to the leadership of Saudi Arabia. Obviously, they imposed blockades on it. They stopped the free passage in the land border between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, through which passed majority of its food grains, majority of its medicines, etc. They closed their airspace for the Qataris airlines, even civilian airways. Qatar was, and they also persuaded other Muslim states to put similar pressure on Qatar. It was particularly humiliating for Qatar to face this kind of a blockade, where Egypt and Libya and Jordan and Morocco and even tiny Maldives in the Indian Ocean were made to gang up together and criticize Qatar and hold it against that. Qatar took the complaint to the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal, reminded that all the member states had obligations to provide free passage. There was no wartime to stop their block their airspace or block the land passage. Now the problem with the International Civil Aviation Organization, like all such international organizations, is that it can issue commands, advice, etc. It cannot really make sovereign governments do something which they don't want to do. It reminded them, Saudi Arabian court, that they were signatories to a treaty. It suggested that alternative air passage should be opened for the Qataris, and so the maritime routes also. But for 4 years, this kind, and of these 4 years, 2017 to 2021, 4.5 years, let's not forget that 2.5 years almost were the COVID period, when the whole world was grappling with the COVID pandemic, and there was one more other pressure of how to reach vaccines in time, how to vaccinate the population, how to sort of these countries, whether it was tourism or entrepot trade, depended on international traffic. So if air traffic was stopped, if maritime traffic was blocked, how would a small country survive? How would the expatriates who were running the economies of these countries? So there was an exodus of expats from Saudi Arabia, from UAE to India, to a certain extent from Qatar and Bahrain also, Kuwait also. So the government of India ran humanitarian Vande Mataram flights for this. But all that apart, this made us realize, made the world realize, especially after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, that the disunity in the GCC could not be allowed to continue. There had to be a renewed effort to get the members of the GCC together, so at least the community interests of this area could be served, both strategic and humanitarian. The Qataris proved to be of very strong will. They stood up to the blockade imposed by Saudi Arabia and UAE. They continued to flourish. They survived the COVID crisis. They survived the exodus of expatriates. And they very carefully and farsightedly kept their bridges open with Iran. So the talk with Taliban started in Doha. They had projected their significance for policy formulators, decision makers in the Western world through Doha round of World Economic Forum. But when the negotiations started post Trump's declaration that there are some good Taliban with whom Americans could talk. So the rounds started in Doha. So this normalization of the situation in Afghanistan, it did not end up the desired way. It ultimately ended up in a humiliating retreat by America from Afghanistan, but nobody had anticipated that. But in the process, Qatar had also projected its international significance as a hub of negotiations which could bring peace to the region. So, this was a recognition that the Saudis would not get far by fighting with the Qataris. So probably it would be better to come close to Qatar. Other factors which contributed is the efforts at normalization by Israel with Saudi Arabia and UAE. So one would argue that if Israelis, sworn enemies of the Muslims, Palestinians and others elsewhere, were being befriended by the Saudi Arabs, how could the Saudis and the Emirate people be inimical towards a fellow Muslim country next door with whom they did not really have a clash of interest at all. So this was one. So I think these accords contributed towards it. Iran's looming threat of nuclear weaponization has been a matter of great concern for America, of course for Israel. If the Israelis attack the nuclear installations in Iran, Iranis might retaliate by hitting out at targets in Saudi Arabia, American assets elsewhere, even maybe in the Emirate region, and interfere with their trade, commerce, their normal life. So there is a need to bring down tensions, and the process of bringing down tensions starts with making up with the Qataris. So what started in 2017, by 2021 has ended. 2 summits took place. One summit took place in January 2021 and the other in the December, where it is becoming quite obvious that a new life is being injected into GCC, partly because of what has happened in Afghanistan, partly because of what is happening in Iran, partly why Iran has not buckled under either American pressure or Israeli blackmailing to withdraw from Lebanon. It continues helping Hezbollah. It continues helping Houthis in Saudi Yemen. And interestingly, the Houthis in Saudi Yemen are also assisted by UAE, who's on all other battlefronts with Saudi Arab. So there are these small things which were there. So we see that the Gulf Cooperation Council is getting a new lease of life. This brings us to the most important question: how does it affect Indian national interest? 3 points quickly we must note and underline. India has had very close historic ties, centuries old, with this whole region, much before the advent of Islam on this planet. The Arabs came to India, Indians went to Arab lands. So whether it is Oman and Muscat, is fringes of Saudi Arabia, it is Basra, Kuwait, Bahrain, Indians have had close contacts with this region. So these ties are there. The second thing which we said is that the population density is very scarce. The countries like Oman and Saudi Arabia might have vast expanses, but other countries are archipelagos, islands, small concentrations of population, large concentration of population in small urban agglomerates. So they are dependent on Indian immigrants. So the Indian diaspora in this region comes very close to 8-9 million, which is a large diaspora. At one time, the remittances sent by them were the most important contribution to the dwindling foreign exchange reserves to India. This is, thank God, not the critical situation today, but their presence there raises other challenges. Many of them have gone there in search for a better future, to be trapped into bonded labor, to be exploited by whimsical, tyrannical owners or masters. Their passports are confiscated. At times there are cases where they don't even know of law and they are charged with capital punishment and so on. So, and especially when the COVID crisis broke out, there was a humanitarian crisis of lifting these sons and daughters of India back in time to India, because they might be denied proper medical care or vaccination there, because they would be treated not as exactly first-class citizens in the countries where absolute monarchy prevailed, where the small number of population, not always properly educated, because education was considered to be a threat by absolute monarchies, would react very differently to outsiders. So they would be either seen as carriers of disease or people who could be sacrificed, to put it harshly. So this is something which India has had to cope with. But the third thing, and which is the most important thing, is the scale of international trade which India carries on with this region. Take the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council: Saudi Arab, Qatar, Oman Muscat, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. It amounts to almost 100 billion US dollars, which is slightly larger than the scale of international trade between India and China. It's almost as much as between India and America. It's almost matches what India does with European Union. So interestingly, what we must see, that while India's trade with an individual country, America or China, might be larger, but when you put all these countries together, you have a very, very significant part of India's trade dealing with this. Obviously, is due to oil imports from Saudi Arabia. It's due to oil imports from other oil-producing countries. And since following American advice, we have cut down our relationship, or the significance of our relationship is underestimated with Iran, our dependence on this area for oil imports has become even more. Diaspora we have talked about. Oil imports give it a strategic significance, and of course the trade itself is very interesting, because the part of the trade which goes from India to UAE is part of the trade which otherwise would have gone to Pakistan across the border under normal times. So there are these. Dubai is a very interesting entrepot where trade can go to different countries, to as far as to China, to Latin America, to whatever it is. So what we should remember is, economically, this area is very important to us. Strategically, the area is very important to us, particularly after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Historically, we have memories of happy relationships with all these countries. An additional factor is that India is the second or the third, depending on how you count it, largest concentration of Muslim population on this planet after Indonesia and Pakistan. So this segment of Indian population has an affinity, religious, spiritual, towards Hajj pilgrimage, Saudi Arabia, but that cannot be the overriding, dominating consideration in our relationship. We have to balance our relationship with Gulf Cooperation Council members in all three grounds. Historical memories, useful. Diaspora's presence, interesting. Complicated challenges. They cannot change public opinion. There is no such thing as public opinion in absolute monarchies. We have to worry about them, but their protection can't be the topmost priority. What is the topmost priority is the scale of economic relationship which we have with these countries, and how these countries or the developments there impinge on our own security concerns. More so in the context of general destabilization in the Middle East, in West Asia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, to a certain extent Egypt. So this is all we have for you this time. Please think about these things carefully, and we come and meet you again next week with another topic. Till then, thank you and goodbye.